The information presented in this podcast is general. It is intended for educational and entertainment purposes only. It should be never used to diagnose, prescribe medical or psychological conditions, or replace a physician. Thank you for listening and blessings. Have you ever wished to discover how to help your employees with their occupational stress in a mindful approach? What if there is a way to building a productive and supportive environment for your employees that leads you to influence the organizational culture positively? Well, this is your invitation to join us to Mindful Leader Talk, a podcast on the effects of mindfulness as a secular practice on occupational stress and organizational culture. Welcome to the Mindful Leader Talk podcast, Mindfully Coping with Occupational Stress. I am Dr. Maria Baez, an organizational leadership psychologist, consultant, trainer, and a full-time magician. In today's episode, we have harnessing technology for mindful leadership, promoting pro-social behaviors, and reducing stress. Today, we have a very, very special guest. He is an HR professional whose favor lies in learning and development, recruitment, employee engagement, and strategic HR, human resources. He is oriented toward organizational evolution, aligned missions and cultures with sustainable capital models, and bringing the gap between strategies, objective, and the core values of individuals and organizations. He maintains a cross-industry background, e-commerce and startup, developing policies, surveys, and assessment tools. His extensive academic journey includes a bachelor degree in psychology, second bachelor degree in religious studies, a master's degree in industrial organizational psychology, and a PhD in organizational psychology, leadership, and ethics. My dear friend, my colleague, Dr. Andrew Partchment, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. You know, personally, I think it's always an honor to share a space with you generally. So I'm super excited to be here. And I think we've got a pretty good conversation cut out for today.
Yes. I'm very, very excited, thrilled. How has technology changed the way we approach mindfulness in the workplace?
You know what's interesting about this question, and I spent a little bit of time thinking about it. I was like, 20 minutes ago, we were talking about the advancements of cars from horses.
Yes.
2 seconds later, Y2K, the world was crashing. 20 minutes somewhere around there, we were talking about financial institutions crashing. And essentially, the advancement of technology, I think, as we talk about it today, is more so seen hardware, computers, the physical robotics. And I think my current focus is, to a degree, artificial intelligence and robotics and what they look like in environments today. What's really interesting that I've seen is most leaders generally just say, hey, we're using this new platform. There's this new introduction of technology. It might happen in an organizational town hall, or you're just debriefed about it in a meeting. Generally, we don't really think about what that means, what the implications are for engagement, for satisfaction, for how people generally operate in the workplace. And technology is at the center of it all. Technology is the evolutionary piece to organizational development and growth. And as we talk about even going into space, organizations that are focusing on that, technology is at the center of it all. It is one of those things that can also be the scary person in the corner.
Correct.
To it. Technology is kind of similar to another employee that you're introducing to the organization, and it has the ability to usher in a great level of ease that people are generally utilizing for their day-to-day work practices, or it can serve as nothing short of a mental barrier for how we're thinking about what our jobs look like in the future, how we're thinking about how to utilize it. And I think ChatGPT and a lot of the robotics you think about, like Amazon physical warehouse, practices that are being advanced with more robotics, we're not really thinking so much about the implications for them long term. We're kind of just sitting down in a place of fear of what that means for the everyday person right now. And I would say that it leads to the thought of, should we be embracing technology? So technology is not a substitute for us, but more so a counterpart for us in organizations. And the leaders themselves serve as the perfect person to be able to usher it, to desensitize employees to it, and to help them understand and establish what the actual relationship is.
Beautiful.
I think about it as an older sibling finding out that they're having a baby brother or baby sister that's being introduced to the family. At some point, mom and dad need to have that conversation with the older sibling so that they understand expectations. You are now going to be functioning as an older sibling. These are the responsibilities. These are the things that you should be thinking about. And there's this ongoing guidance and coaching that happens in that same space that we should be thinking about technology. We're introducing a new baby or a new child into the space, and you wouldn't just bring them into the house without talking about what they're doing there and how they're going to be integrated into the family dynamic. I don't personally like making comparisons of organizations to families, but I do think that that's a pretty good one that helps us understand there needs to be sensitivity, communication, and it's not going to be a one-size-fits-all model for how technology is going to change and advance the work that we're doing within organizations.
Beautiful, beautiful. I like and I am attuned with that approach, seeing technology as another employee inside the organization. And the other analogy, seeing the organization as a family. Because what is a family? Family is an structure. What is an organization? An organization is another structure. So it's really a mindful thought that we are putting in there. And leading to the second question, how can leaders balance the use of technology to promote mindfulness without it becoming a source of stress?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I'll kind of like elaborate a little bit more on the familial piece that we were just talking about. Any child is going to be stressed at the idea of a new child coming in. What's happening? Am I being replaced? Is this going to be an addition or a substitution? And I think that like the leader needs to be conscious of what that looks like. An empathetic and a mindful leader will say to themselves, when there was change being introduced to me, how did I react? What are the things that I should have been thinking about? How did this play out from a me understanding the systems around me perspective? And how do I alleviate some of the stress that might have come at some point in time before? How do I do that for my staff now?
Also navigate through the uncertainty that creates when a new element gets into the play.
100%. And I would say that parents would generally also agree that it's not a, hey, we're having a new baby's getting introduced to the space, and that's where the conversation ends. You still have to think about, I need to coach my 10-year-old on how to interact with now a 4-year-old. And when the 10-year-old becomes 18 and that 4-year-old is now 12, based on those numbers, like an 18-year-old and a 12-year-old, there's still kind of like conditioning, there's coaching, there's modeling of behavior that feel like they're appropriate. These are the ways that I would interact with the child. These are the ways that you should interact with the child. And so there should never be the idea that there's a substitute in some way, shape, or form. That perception can absolutely lead to stress, deviant behaviors within organization, and just overall shift in the culture. So leaders should be intentionally communicating all throughout the process. It's not a start, stop, and then we'll kind of like revisit this in 18 years. There's always going to be some sort of continuous loop of improvement and some evolution that's happening in that space. And so leaders essentially need to say, hey, people that I can communicate with, this is the role of technology. As that role of technology evolves, I want you to be aware of what these advancements now mean. And if there are no changes, sometimes communicating, this is just going to be something shiny to sit on that's going to help you. And it's really up to the employees themselves to then start asking questions. But for the most part, I would say that the leader needs to be proactive. Think about like pro-social behaviors within organizations that are supporting a community culture. They are sitting at the ability to do that and engaging in dialogue around the technology. I oftentimes think of like older generations that have great resistance to, hey, these are the systems that it's the change management piece. These are the systems that we're now using and we're going to have to integrate it. I, for the most part, see a lot of resistance happening with that specific population. And it's mostly because they don't understand why the change needs to happen or sometimes it's we're at the end of the road. I'm going to retire in 20 minutes. I think that there's still an argument to be made. Even though you're going to retire, this technology doesn't just exist in a bubble within the organization. It's something that we should be integrating as technology is becoming the way of the future.
Correct. Permeating the whole entire organization and beyond. How would you define pro-social and deviant behaviors in the context of a workplace?
So you know that this is like my passion spot. And it's funny because any normal human being would say deviant behaviors that does not sound good. Pro-social are kind of like the highly engaged employee behaviors where it's you're thinking about the things that'll contribute to the organization in a positive way. And they could be very subtle things and they just need to be countered to deviant behaviors. So I would think of it a little to the extent of it being black and white. The deviant behaviors are the resistant behaviors that can absolutely be mitigated. And then the pro-social behaviors are the ones that you're like, this is our brand champion. They're illustrating kind of like that peer-to-peer communication, that mentoring, those skills that you want to see that make the culture a little bit more rich. Within the scope of deviant behaviors, I feel like there's this large Rolodex of options that you have. And I think one for me that is at the center of my research. So incivilities are kind of like there. Yes. They are the big deviant ones that I always focus on because they're the subtle ones that have the ability to spiral and become a little bit more explosive. So
I remember that word.
Right. I'll give a couple of examples of like small things that most people don't think about. You're in the office and you essentially use the last pot of coffee. You don't actually replace the coffee. It's an unspoken rule. You use it last, you replace it. It doesn't make a difference if it's 3 p.m. Somebody else will need coffee.
Exactly.
That subtle action and failing to replace the coffee, considered deviant because it goes against social norms. Yes. And the social norm would be that we are kind of like holding each other close, that we're kind of like doing organizational citizenship type behaviors that make people feel good or don't kind of like cause any disruption to their work.
Supporting and then each other.
Absolutely. And so incivilities are so subtle, they're so nuanced that something small like failing to replace a pot of coffee because you took the last one can actually turn into something a year from now that looks like people being a little bit more physical with one another in the organization. And I think we all know harassment is kind of like a big thing that like we don't talk about it in the same ways because all of the states have their trainings around harassment. But generally, these deviant behaviors have the ability to cripple your organization from a poor culture perspective. So you look at like a Glassdoor or an Indeed review, and it just talks about poor leadership. It talks about poor ways of working, extreme hours, people not being respectful, all within the spectrum of deviant behaviors. Something small, failing to share information or refill a coffee pot can be what starts that essential gradual build up to people now having contentious relationships with one another. There's also kind of just like people just not being nice to each other within the organization. And those are counter to the pro-social piece. We know we're not going to be best friends with everyone. One of my favorite lines is, this is not RuPaul's best friends race. And for the most part, sometimes you're competing against other people for that same next step role within an organization. It doesn't mean that you can't be respectful. And I think that respect is kind of like this underlying swimming tone between deviant and pro-social behaviors, because the lack of respect, the lack of trust, the lack of communication, that kind of like pushes people in one direction versus the other. And that's why you'll see cultures that are like, everyone here is so nice, they're so generous with their time, and they'll have a culture of kindness or a caring culture. Those will typically be the organizations that illustrate the pro-social behaviors. The organizations where you're fighting for resources, and you'll kind of like see this within like sales teams often, where there's a competition between one and another, introduces the ability for people to then start inserting negative behaviors into the process. And so the leader at the center of it all has the ability to juggle what behaviors we want to see extinguished and what behaviors we want to see duplicated. So rewarding pro-social behaviors and kind of like giving very critical feedback on the deviant behaviors is how you have that perfect mix within an organization that the leader is supposed to be doing as a part of their role.
Correct. You don't need to be friend with someone to be nice.
You do not. You can be kind to strangers. And we're in New York. So for the most part, it's funny because I think about it like a walking down the street perspective. New Yorkers always tell you we're not kind Is it that we're not kind, but we're nice, or we're not nice, but we're kind? Whichever one of the two mixes.
Okay.
New Yorkers won't watch people kind of like suffer. They'll always help, but there isn't kind of like this proactive, hey, ma'am, do you need help? It's a, let me give you a hint that, and then I go about my business versus it being a, I'm just going to walk past this person and pretend like I don't see it and the world doesn't really exist for me because pretending like I don't see it. So there's kind of like a little bit of a juggle with how we operate, and respect is very much so at the basis of it all.
Yes. And as you can meet someone who is kind and always willing to help, also when sometimes you can meet people that they are very rude with you because they are war in themselves, that when they find someone who is kind, they react rudely and mindless.
Yeah, for sure.
We have everything here.
I would throw the thought out there that it costs you nothing to be neutral.
Yeah, correct.
Like, rudeness is a choice. Kindness is also a choice. Being neutral is also an option. It doesn't just need to be or you're kind. I think that there's kind of like this general flat tone that people can generally take that doesn't impact other people in a negative way. And it doesn't take away from it. Kindness is also very easy, but it doesn't come naturally to everyone, some would argue.
Well, I agree with that. Always you're going to have a choice.
Yes.
Every one of us has a choice. You can react rude or you can react nicely. So always it's going to be a choice.
Yeah, for sure.
What role does mindfulness play in promoting pro-social behaviors among employees? I would like to pick your brain in that sense.
You know, I would say kind of like so basic. I think that we spend so much time kind of like advancing our own careers, advancing our own family lives that for the most part, we think is very individuals, but we don't really think we're individuals as a part of a larger collective. And that for me, kind of like the level of mindfulness that leaders should essentially be having with any changes in organizations that anyone should be having in terms of respect. And so from a mindfulness perspective, I think that it's just a matter of understanding that you could be on the receiving end of whatever it is that you're delivering. There's the golden rule, there's a platinum rule, do unto others as they would do unto you. And then it's like treat people how they want to be treated. I think that is kind of like at the top of just a mindful leader being able to introduce to an organization, this is how we work. And I think that the how we work is the unspoken piece that everyone needs walking in through the door of an organization so that they understand how to navigate. If a leader is taking that proactive approach, it means that they're intentional, which suggests that there's mindfulness behind their approach. And even if they're just attempting to mitigate risk or they don't want to deal with problems in the end, that's still a level of mindfulness of what today's actions have as a repercussion for later behaviors. So leaders starting by exhibiting the same pro-social behaviors that they want everyone else to illustrate is at the core.
That's at the core.
You can't reasonably say, I want my team to be attentive, detail-oriented, effective communicators that are working 50 hours a week. If you are not the leader that's exhibiting the behavior, your team will immediately see through it. There will be nothing pro-social that comes from it. It'll just be resistant and deviant behaviors that come afterwards. And so leaders leading by example, which is
leading by example,
basic, that's the start of being a mindful leader, illustrating those same behaviors that you want your employees to illustrate. And sometimes it's a matter of, I need to name it for you so that you understand what I'm doing and why I'm the type of leader that I am. And that costs a leader nothing to engage in a conversation with their team to say, I lead with empathy. These are the things that I do to get my job done. These are the things that you should also be doing because they're linked to our organization morals, our values, our fundamentals for how we behave and why we're going to be successful. Once that alignment happens after the illustrator is kind of like establishing expectations, nothing short of like an easy glide down the road, with the exception of like the organizational nuance of like finding funding and things like that. So I think the starting point is like people just being conscious of, this is not me as a bubble in isolation. I should be mindful of what I'm doing and how it impacts other people. And that is the start of pro-social behaviors, being conscious of your work and how it impacts others.
Correct. It's like you are not an isolated piece of the whole puzzle. You are part of the puzzle as well as others. Can you share some challenges that mindful leaders may face when they are trying to promote pro-social behaviors and how you think that they can overcome it?
Yeah, I think that like the world is not a black and white place, even though pro-social and deviant behaviors, I kind of like gave them with the world isn't black and white. And I think we have to understand that there's gray in the middle, there's shades of white, and then there's shades of black. And
a whole spectrum of light.
And then there's a whole rainbow that's behind the black and white is the funny part. I think that the leaders themselves, like their role in mitigating behaviors, their role in promoting pro-social behaviors and their orientation to kind of like that specific element, it feels like it's so basic, but it also feels like it's the missing piece. And I'm sure like if you talk to any person that's worked in an organization, they'll tell you about a bad boss. And I oftentimes think of leaders that took the time and explained things to me. I'm the type of person that if my brain does not understand what the task is, I'm not going to do it the way it needs to be done. So when we think of behaviors, and I'll kind of like go back to that familial reference from the beginning, if you were kind of like sticking your hand on the stove, how do you tell your child to not stick their hand on the stove if that's all they see, if it's all they know, if it's kind of things that you are doing that they are aspiring towards? And so the leader themselves need to start by communicating effectively throughout the whole process. I think when I talk to some of my peers that are people leaders, and I tell everyone this all the time, I don't want to be a people leader because I recognize that half of the job is managing people and then you have work to do. And managing people in itself is a whole job, right?
It's a whole job, correct.
It's a whole job in itself. From that perspective, you can't just let one fall to the side and focus on your work and just be like, the people will come along for it. You have to effectively communicate consistently throughout the process. And some of the best leaders that I've ever had are the ones that communicate. They communicate specifically to the style that I learn. So it's not just a matter of saying like, hey, I'm going to talk to everyone the exact same way, blanket across the board. You have to realize every human is a little bit different. And I'll also say this. My mom would argue that, no, you love all your kids the same way. And I always give her pushback that you have loved us all the same way. The learning lesson that I came into in adulthood is you can't love all of your kids the exact same way. They're not the same person, right?
They are not, correct.
You open a large Christmas gift the same way that you open something that's soft and clearly a little bit more delicate. You're intentional. You're thinking about the different approach for one versus the other. And I'm not saying that you're making concessions where you're holding hands with people. You're still going to be fair and consistent.
Correct.
But you're also considering what people's different learning styles are. And then you're using that to infuse the conversation around these are the behaviors that are pro-social. These are the behaviors that are deviant that we don't want to see. And I think that a lot of times leaders struggle with having those frank conversations with people. And sometimes it's a little bit challenging to give someone feedback like, hey, these behaviors aren't necessarily what we promote from our cultural perspective. But there is a moment where if you don't address it, all you're going to see is more of the behavior duplicated by other people. If Susie can do it, why can't I do it? If Susie and Mike can do it, I'm definitely going to do it because why would my life be any different? And that's how you create duplications of behaviors, whether they're good or they're bad. If you see Susie doing good, hard work and she's got a strong relationship with her leader because she has that flow of communication, the leader is being intentional, it'll say, how do I get that relationship between Susie and Mike as a leader and an employee? And I think that it's a way of engaging the workforce in a way that we haven't really done before. I don't want to say that people leaders should just lead people and leave the projects to the side because that's not a realistic model for organizations to operate in. But there needs to be kind of enough buffer for leaders to be intentional about the emotional awareness of their staff, how they communicate, how they're engaging consistently throughout the day, throughout the week, throughout the year. And then like, what are the adjustments that I need to make? The last piece that I'll throw out there is there needs to be a feedback loop. So if I, as a leader, am creating this top-down dynamic, what's the difference between that and kind of like a dictatorship? Nothing. Versus if I say, hey, what's your preferred learning style as a community? What are the things that we could be doing to enhance the experience? I will be unlocking the door to allow pro-social behaviors to come in once I start creating an environment and a culture that feels like it's sustainable for employees to have a good time at work. Correct. And we spend so much time at work. And I was hoping that at some point that this would not have been the thing that you hear. I've been hearing this my entire life and I'm almost 40. Oh, I just said that on a podcast. podcast.
Oh.
I've been hearing it my entire life. You just work hard. You work hard. You work hard. Hard work will have the reward.
It's like a cliche that
it
you
is
have.
Absolutely a cliche. At some point in time, the hard work should not always be you on the grind. I think that there's a level of mindfulness of like how we support one another. And when we see someone having that extra need for help, the leader being conscious of it. And it's all around the mindfulness from that perspective. And then the team being able to help out. You don't need to be a formal people leader to be that advocate for the rest of your team or the person that's bringing recommendations to the top. I think that there's a very clear way for you to not be a people leader and still have a great deal of influence that might actually be more powerful than your mindful leader that has formal title that's a VP or a director or whatever it is. There's still influence, and it's a matter of like consciousness and mindfulness for how we shape, frame, and communicate things with one another.
Correct. It's about perspective.
It absolutely is.
Can you share any success story or cases where mindfulness and technology combined has significantly improved workplace behaviors and reduced stress? Just a little bit.
You know, I've got a story. And this story is interesting enough. I won't say where it was, but I was working with this leader. He and I were the same age, fantastic individual, very oriented towards technological advancements. His big thing was, we've got technology, we have to use it. Never really did a good job of introducing it to his staff and would always have these challenges around their metrics that came out of the technology. And so, very basic example, it's a matter of like using a kiosk and timeliness around it and like why it's important that we follow these specific steps because it creates the reports that determine where people fall on their performance metrics. This leader very clearly didn't train people. It was a matter of like, yeah, you guys train each other. Didn't formally say it, but that's the practice that was there. So no mindfulness of how the technology was integrated into the team. And then the technology was used to assess where people fell in terms of metrics.
Okay.
Very blanket statement. He would be giving feedback and he would come and say, we need to coach this person on performance because they're not using the tech in the way it was designed. And my immediate response was, they're brand new. Did we train them on how to use the technology? We're assessing them on metrics and they don't really have good numbers because they're doing all of the workarounds to avoid the technology that they think is going to take away from their job. How do you change that? You need to start engaging in conversations with your team. And because it was almost like a 24-hour operation, it felt like there was never a good time to pause and have those intentional conversations.
Yes.
And the truth is, as cliche as the statement is, you don't swallow an elephant whole. You take it down in chunks, right? Take it in small bites. It's not just a matter of this one employee. If they're doing it, other people have taught them that practice, right?
Correct.
And the duplication of the negative behaviors that you don't want to see are exactly what's happening because you didn't insert yourself into the process in a mindful way that would have broken the ice between these two bubbles that existed. Fast forward, the story ends with him having to take a moment to actually reintroduce the technology to the staff. It was boring. It was actually more painful to do the reintroduction because the folks that already knew about it and kind of like accepted it, they were fine. They didn't care. But the folks that were resistant to it, they were just like, I still don't get why we're doing this. And it's been here for a long time. I have all of these workarounds. Why don't we just stick with the workarounds? Now you're facing a different level of change management where people have viable arguments for why the technology isn't actually necessary. And so you didn't usher the child into the house in the appropriate way. And now you're essentially coaching the children that are already there for how to engage, but it's a year or two already into the process. The challenge is introducing it now is actually going to be harder than if you made the upfront effort. And so all of that is a lesson in proactive communication, being an engaging leader with your staff. I think his big takeaway from this was technology is a good example of what we need to do. But if I know that there's an organizational change that's coming down the line that's going to require a significant amount of change management, how do I start introducing it subtly to the people so that it doesn't come as a complete shock? People aren't completely afraid of using this technology. And interestingly enough, as I like to think of the organization, they're kind of like backing away from technology to a certain extent. And I transparently think that it's because they didn't introduce it to their employees in the right way. And they're also a customer facing organization. They didn't introduce it to the customers in the right way either. And so you saw the general resistance to change. You saw very clear deviant behaviors that existed around it, like literally people just having fits and shouting matches in a establishments where you should not be having them. And it's because the introduction of the technology didn't happen from a mindful, structured way that allowed people to say, I get what you're doing here. Now let me embrace it. And so I think that pause moment before we're doing anything radical. And I think most organizations are like, we need to revolutionize this. If you're not revolutionizing an industry in some way, shape, or form, you're probably not going to be sustainable long term because no one's looking at you. And I think ChatGPT is a really good example of that. ChatGPT was doing the same thing that everybody else was doing. They were just doing it in silence. ChatGPT, however, said, hey, we want you to start interacting with this new tool that we've been building over time. It is your way to kind of like desensitize yourself to it to a great degree. And the amount of people that started utilizing ChatGPT from the moment that they started talking about it till now exponentially grew. People are embracing it and they're like, I can actually use this to make my life easier. Are they using it the right way? Completely different conversation. However, at the end of the day, what they are doing is they're interacting with something to become more desensitized to it, which means that they're embracing it in their homes. For someone like Google and everyone else that's like, now we're introducing ChatGPT versions to your phone, people are like, wait, what do you mean? And so I think that it's kind of like how you introduce it. It almost feels like that is at the core of whether people are going to embrace it or not. You'll always have your naysayers. You'll always have your people that are pro-change, but there's a very large group of people that are sitting in the middle that can be swayed either pro-social or deviant. Correct. And it's the leader or whoever it is that's introducing the change to make sure that it's done in the right way. And it's not just good marketing, it's good communication.
Correct. It is how you approach it and how you transmit this approach inside the organization, because that's why it's going to make the difference between how they capture and if they capture the essence of what you want to transmit. Yeah. What was the Partchment?
Wait, I got one more thought for you, and it's something related to something you wrote that I was reading.
Go ahead.
Mindfulness and how mindfulness is kind of this, in paraphrasing, but it's kind of like one of the foundational building blocks for trust within organizations, right? And so I think I might have like read that in your dissertation somewhere, and I was like, oh no, this is at the core of why all of these organizations keep on failing, because there's no trust. There's no trust because there wasn't a mindful approach to things that were happening, and I think it's a really good example of like how something so small where it's just like just thinking about it is literally at the core. A thought is at the core of if my organization becomes sustainable for the next 100 years or if it falls and if it crumbles. And from that perspective, I would say that as subtle as mindfulness is, and most people would say it's very hard to kind of like measure mindfulness, it is not that hard to measure mindfulness, and it's not that hard to be intentional about it either. I think it's really a matter of are you doing the right thing for right's sake? And it's kind of like it's related to ethical approaches to how you build relationships and foundations for organizations. But I would say that mindfulness, it's such a subtle running thread that communication is great. But if you're not thinking about it, then you won't do it. Right. And then you won't have the relationships. You won't necessarily build that ongoing customer base. The mindfulness thread is kind of like what everyone is holding on to, but not really naming. And people should be saying we need to be intentional, we need to be mindful, and it is how we essentially establish ourselves within whatever marketplace we're in.
Yes, correct. I think we should continue this conversation because there is a lot more to cover. Mindfulness, as you said, is not the main goal. Mindfulness is not a goal. It's a way of living.
Agreed.
Yes. So I am very, very honored and grateful to have you here. Thank you so very much for having the time to meet with us and also to share your experience. And you need to come back.
Absolutely. I'll be back tomorrow.
So if anyone would like to know more about the work that you do, be in contact with you, is that possible?
Absolutely. Is this where I drop my socials?
Yes.
I would say the best place to find me is on LinkedIn. My full name is Andre Chung Partchment on LinkedIn, but if you type in AUNDRAE, there's but like 5 people on LinkedIn with their first name spelled that way, so it won't be that hard to find me. Working on some exciting writing projects that I don't think that they're revolutionary. I think that they're very mindful at the very least, and there should be some things that are coming out on LinkedIn in the near future. So
okay, beautiful. Thank you so very much, Dr. Partchment. I look forward to meeting again.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me, and happy Thursday. Thanks so much.
If you have any questions, concerns, or comment, please visit my website www.mbaezconsulting.com or send me an email to maria@mbaezconsulting.com. This is the Mindful Leader Talk, a podcast on the effects of mindfulness as a secular practice on occupational stress and organizational culture. Feel free to invite, to listen, or share this podcast. Stay in tune for all coming episodes to building profitable organizations driven by the well-being of their employees and therefore our society. In the meantime, please stay safe. Blessings.